I come from a big family of 8 kids, of which I am the 5th. My eldest sibling is 35, and my youngest sibling is 14. My parents had their first kid when they were 17 and basically didn't stop. We were a very close-knit family, and my parents were definitely the sort to adopt boyfriends and girlfriends and get very attached. My parents were, and probably still are, very, very religious, hence the whole 8 kids deal. Way back in 2008, I was 17 and dating a guy, who we can call Ben, who was the godson of my brother-in-law. We had grown up together and started dating when we were around 13, so 4 or 5 years, because my family had always sort of pushed us together. Ben was very close to my parents. They saw him as a second son and all of that other Taylor Swift cliché stuff. We were super different people, and that sort of culminated in me cheating on him with a guy, John, I vaguely knew through a friend of a friend's older brother at a party. This was a serious dick move, but I continued to see John throughout the year when he was back from university, and eventually it moved past I'm having S with somebody my parents don't like, approve of, into I genuinely like this guy and I want to be with him. I tried to break up with Ben a few times, and it didn't go very well. But the whole clusterduck eventually culminated on my family walking in on me having S with John on the couch in our basement. I don't want to excuse this behavior because it was super wrong and horrible of me, and I regret being the girl who cheated on her long-term boyfriend. We were the couple who were voted most likely to stay together because we were so close and had been together for so long. This was all compounded by the fact that John had a reputation and wasn't the greatest guy in high school, which is all my parents knew about him. To make a long story short, I was kicked out by my parents because of what I'd done to Ben. None of my siblings wanted anything to do with me, which really hurt because we were so close and dependent on one another. And my youngest siblings, my sister closest to me in age, weren't allowed to have anything to do with me. My siblings also told most of my relatives exaggerated versions of the story, in which I was a W who had slept with half the town and Ben was in a very bad place because of what I had done. The whole situation should have just been a storm in a teacup, but it ended up becoming a huge family drama, and I was eventually kicked out and sent to live with my uncle and his wife in another part of the country. Since then, August 2008, nobody in my immediate family has had anything to do with me or spoken to me. My uncle passes on occasional bits of information, such as my sisters getting married, and my youngest brother's sports achievements. Nothing major that actually lets me know what is going on in their lives. I was basically frozen out and cut off from that day forth. Despite all of this, John and I became involved in an LDR, and eventually I went to university in the town where he lived. We moved in together, and we are now engaged, and we have a son together, who is nearly 2. All up, we have been together in some form for about 8 years. I recently finished my master's degree and began work in a relatively big company doing PR work. I get on really well with all of my coworkers. It's just the job that I imagined having when I began studying way back in 2009, but it turns out that one of my coworkers is actually my middle sister's husband. This was a big shock to me. He knew who I was. I had no clue who he was, and he went back to my family and told them about me. Apparently, he must like me because my father called my uncle and told him that my sister's husband worked with me. I sounded like a lovely and well-matured adult with a beautiful family. They would like to meet me as soon as possible and make up for missed time. Specifically focused on getting to know my son before he's too old for his relationship with his cousins to be normal. My uncle told me that apparently they have changed their minds about John and they would also like to get to know him properly. This might sound ridiculous, but I'm torn between telling them to say no and leaving my job so I don't have to work with Scott, my sister's husband, and have all of my information ferried back to my family, and saying yes because I have spent the last 8 years missing them all so much and partially regretting the choices that got me where I am today. As far as I can tell, they want to meet me again to apologize for freezing me out and cutting me out of their lives completely and rebuild the relationship that we had. But I have always felt that they chose Ben over me, and that if any of my siblings wanted to get in touch with me, they had 8 years to do so, and I also worry that there might still be some forms of resentment. What do my younger brother and sister think about this whole thing? What were they told? Left over on their behalves. I also desperately want to see my family again, to be part of my family again, and to let my kid grow up with both sides of his family. I was fully inducted into John's family from day one and am so grateful to have them, but I have this terrible pang in my chest that I have a found family instead of my real one. John supports me in whatever choice I make, but I'm also really scared of them being horrible to him, even though he has supported me since the second my parents told me I had to leave. I have discussed this with my friends, with my sister-in-law, with my aunt and uncle, and I still have no idea what to do. I would love to be a part of my family again. I would love for my son to grow up with more than just 2 cousins and no grandparents, but I am so scared of what might happen if I say yes. Edit. What I did was abhorrent and very wrong. I have always felt guilty about cheating on Ben, and I accept full responsibility for it. However, I was 17 years old at the time. I was making a lot of poor choices. John wasn't a nice kid in high school. I think he was also mean to my older brother in some capacity when they were about 13, and my parents got the idea of him from that time period. In addition to this, he had a reputation for getting around and getting into, and he raced cars, stopped before I was kicked out after a crash. He's 2.5 years older than me. My sister's husband, Ben's godfather, is 13 years older than her and was her advisor at university, so my understanding of it has not been that they disliked the age gap or were concerned about statutory R. They also didn't have a problem with premarital S when it was a boy they had approved of. I dug out my old diaries to give you an approximate timeline of the events. October 2007. I met John at a party. We hit it off and I got his number because he was selling a car for about $500 and I was about to get my full license. January 2008. I tried to break up with Ben for the first time before we went back for year 12, junior year. He laughed it off as a joke despite me explicitly saying I wanted to see other people. Halfway through January, I saw John again at another party and we made out, that was all. We also began communicating through MSN Messenger and getting to know one another. February 2008. Ben and I had a fight that was resolved by one of my sisters. We were split up for about 2 weeks, and during this time, I slept with John for the first time. I saw it as a way of having control over my life. Outside of this, I spent most of my time with my family, at church, they are Catholic, at school activities my father chose, and with Ben. March 2008. I tried to break up with Ben before he invited me to a family function. He went home and got his dad to call my father, who then told me I would be attending the function. I think it was a wedding, with him. I ended up going as a supervising student on a school camp, so I had to miss the wedding. My mom and older sister started to put pressure on me to stay with Ben because he makes you happy. We know him. He's Catholic too, and so forth. April 2008. I tried one last time to break up with Ben, and he told me he would K himself if I broke up with him because I was the only person he wanted to be with who he could trust. I felt a lot of pressure about the whole situation, and in my mind, I felt that if I kept cheating on him, he would feel the need to break up with me, and my parents and sisters would stop pressuring me to be in a relationship with him. It also felt like a way to express myself. I knew very little about S and what it involved. John came back for mid-semester break, and we started sleeping together more. I would sneak out at night and see him, etc. It also became apparent to my parents that I was rebelling against their rules. They knew I was sneaking out and drinking, so we had a lot of arguments about that. I also began to have problems with my mental health. June 2008. I began to realize more and more that I didn't want to be with Ben. Being with him made me feel physically ill, and that John made me happy. I liked him a lot, and essentially I wanted to be with him instead of Ben. I told him that on MSN. He told me that the only world in which that would happen would be one where Ben was completely out of the picture. July and August 2008. On the 28th of July, John was back for his nephew's first birthday and he came to visit. My parents walked in on us. There was a furious argument and I was sent to stay with my grandmother and grandfather. There was a meeting with the church to mediate the situation and I was eventually allowed to return. Initially, I was told that I was forgiven for my transgressions, but it became apparent very quickly that I would only be forgiven if I started my relationship with Ben again and attended a 3-month church thing for sinners. I honestly can't remember. I said no. This led to an argument with my older brother. He hit me across the face and I was asked to leave the house. My parents didn't speak to me on the way to the airport, but I assumed that I would be asked back after things had settled down and the dust had cleared. But from then on, I was completely cut off. I'm sure that my uncle has passed on things about me, but I doubt that he said anything major. He and my father really don't get on well at all. I will be calling my aunt tonight to ask what has happened on that front. My wife and I are empty nesters, living in a good-sized 4-bedroom house. Our daughters are in their late 20s and moved out years ago. We talked about downsizing, but never seriously did anything about it. Early this summer, my brother-in-law was fired from his fairly good-paying job and was denied unemployment from his employer for some type of unethical actions. I don't really know what he did, just that he and a couple others did something shady. Their credit is terrible, a bankruptcy in the past, and they really never lived within their means. They have 2 boys, 8 and 13, and 2 good-sized dogs, so their little house was very cramped. They wanted a larger house but couldn't get a loan and had no money for a down payment. Somehow, they convinced his parents to allow them to build a larger related living style house around the parents' small ranch house, and he's been building it for the past year or two, as time and money allowed. Now they have a half-finished huge house they can't move into and have to put their current small home for sale to finance finishing the construction on the new place. To make matters worse, their current house is actually owned by his wife's brother, who bought the house from them so they would not lose it when they went bankrupt, and they have been paying him the mortgage and promised to let him have any profit from the sale. My wife asked me back in June if they could move in with us until the house was completed so they could fix up their current tiny house for sale. I balked at first, since we already have one large dog and didn't like the idea of having 3 dogs, 2 kids, and 4 adults living in my house for an undetermined amount of time. My wife talked me into letting them move in, since we have 3 extra bedrooms, and we regretted it ever since. It started off not too badly, but now it's been 4 months, and my brother-in-law is no closer to getting a new job and is only interested in finding another management job, even though I'm sure his previous employer is bad-mouthing him. He currently does side jobs for another of my wife's brothers who does construction demos, siding jobs, etc. My sister-in-law works part-time as a doctor's office receptionist and makes probably just above minimum wage. All her money goes toward food and gas for their cars. We don't charge them any kind of rent, hoping they can put the money towards finishing the new house construction. The shit hit the fan, so to speak, when they could not pick up their dog's shit from our backyard so I could mow the lawn. I offered to pay my 13-year-old nephew $20 a week to mow the lawn, but he didn't want to do this because it would interrupt his video game playing. When I saw my wife picking up the dog shit while her sister was getting ready to leave the house, I exploded. I told her that if she couldn't pick up after the dogs would have to be sent somewhere else. She got upset and replied that she had no place else to send the dogs. One of the dogs is black, and the house now not only smells like a kennel, but there is black dog hair all over the floors that she won't vacuum up unless my wife tells her to. My sister-in-law and her husband then decided to take his mother's offer of a loan against her retirement money to help financing finishing the house, so she wouldn't have to live with us mean people. Now, 4 months later, they are still here. She no longer really talks to me in the house, comes home from work, and goes straight upstairs to her bedroom to watch television. I guess I'm the bad guy. Her 8-year-old son is left with my wife and I when they come home while his mother is upstairs in her room. Our family room now has toys scattered all around and has 2 bins of Legos, action figures for his amusement. His mother doesn't clean up after him, doesn't tell him to clean up after himself, and leaves the job of putting him to bed at night to her unemployed husband. I'm a big fan of HBO original TV series, which of course are not fit for kids to watch. My nephew also doesn't really have a bedtime either, and I have to tell him to leave the family room sometime between 9 and 10 p.m. so I can finally get around to watching some adult content before going to bed. I honestly don't think they realize what a shitstorm they leave in their path, but just expect everybody to help them out. She's the baby of the family, and my wife said she has always been this way. I guess what I'm looking for is some outside perspective. How do I get rid of them? Am I being too hard on them? This is affecting my relationship with my wife, because she feels like she is the only person in the house taking care of the place while I'm at work. Any suggestions? Help! Well, it all finally came to a head about a week after my previous post. On a Saturday, when I wanted to mow our lawn, my wife asked my sister-in-law to pick up the dog poop. Sister-in-law texted my wife back and stated that she picked up about a half a grocery-sized bag up and told my wife that she could get the rest. This reply really upset my wife and I, so we decided their dogs had to go. My wife phoned my brother-in-law and explained that we had had enough. It was getting too hard to have 3 dogs in the house and to make plans to move the dogs elsewhere. We were on our way to meet our daughter and son-in-law at a restaurant about an hour from home. They had just announced they were expecting their first child, our first grandchild. 5 minutes later, my sister-in-law calls my wife back asking what's the problem, etc., and they get into an argument of what was going wrong. It ends with my sister-in-law telling my wife that if that is the way we were going to be, she was moving her family out of the house as well. She then texted my wife that living in our house, she became to believe that she didn't like the way I treated my wife, and that she noticed it, but that my wife was blind to my treatment of her. Now this upset me even more. I was through with my sister-in-law. When we got home from our dinner out, the dogs were gone and so were they. My wife was upset, but we were both relieved they were gone. Finally, some peace and quiet in the house. They ended up taking their 2 dogs to my brother-in-law's parents' house, where they were constructing their new home. Now my brother-in-law lives at his parents' house with the dogs and the oldest teenage son. My sister-in-law at first moved into her parents' 2-bedroom townhouse with their youngest son and traveled between the 2 locations. So now they have spread their inconvenience to both their elderly parents and their kids just because my sister-in-law was too proud and lazy to pick up after herself and her dogs while in my house. My wife asked her why this was better than just keeping the dogs at one of the other houses while keeping her family together at our house and not spread their troubles to 2 other households, but she didn't have an answer. Now, in the meantime, they have finally sold their old house and my brother-in-law has finally got a full-time regular job. Most of their junk is still in our house. My wife moved most of it to 1 bedroom, and they are in no hurry to move their things out yet. Construction on their new place is still going on. No idea when it will be completed yet. Thanksgiving dinner at my mother-in-law's house was very uncomfortable with my sister-in-law and brother-in-law there with their kids and both sets of parents. I have nothing to do with my sister-in-law now, nor do I want to since she stuck her nose in my relationship with my wife and her comments to my wife about me. My wife's parents are trying to stay above it and not pick sides, but it's wearing on them. My wife and her sister do still talk to each other now, but the relationship is now very cool. It was tough, but at least we have our house back, and we are now trying to get it back in shape after our visitors left. I'm very happy, but I know my wife is still hurt and things are uncomfortable with her family.